Good evening, everyone. Before we get started, be sure to subscribe to the channel and like the video. I'd love to know where you're watching from, so let me know in the comments. Now, lean back and let's dive into this week's horror stories. Urban exploration was my guilty pleasure. Nothing illegal or reckless, just slipping into places that had been left behind. Abandoned factories were my favorite. The cavernous spaces, the layers of graffiti, the eerie silence. It was like stepping into a world forgotten by time. There was an old textile factory on the edge of my town. People said it was dangerous, that the building was falling apart, but I couldn't resist. It had stood there for decades. An evening in late summer last year, as the sun dipped below the horizon, I climbed through a gap in the rusted fence and made my way inside. I had my camera slung around my neck, ready to capture the desolation. The factory was everything I hoped it would be. Vast empty rooms, machinery frozen in time, and peeling paint clinging to the walls. I wandered for hours, snapping photos, losing myself in the quietness. But as I turned a corner, something caught my eye. It was a faint light flickering from a small basement window. It was starting to get dark outside, so the light immediately stood out to me. It didn't make sense. The factory had been abandoned for years. There shouldn't have been electricity, let alone a working light. So my curiosity got the better of me. I found the staircase leading down to the basement where the light was. The basement was colder than the rest of the building. The air felt damp and thick with the smell of mold. I grabbed my flashlight tightly as I descended. When I reached the bottom, I saw it. A single bulb hanging from the ceiling, swaying gently. It shouldn't have been on. The basement was cluttered with debris, broken chairs, old filing cabinets, tools scattered across the floor. But there was something off about the space, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. I was about to raise my camera to capture the scene, but just as I raised it, the light went out. Pitch black darkness swallowed the room. I froze. My flashlight was in my bag. As I was about to reach for it, I heard footsteps. They were slow, but coming closer, descending the same staircase I had just come down. My throat went dry. I hadn't seen or heard anyone else in the building. I'd been completely alone. Or so I thought. The steps grew louder, closer. I finally managed to grab my flashlight and flick it on. I pointed it toward the staircase, but there was no one there. But the footsteps kept coming. Panic surged through me. The steps didn't make sense. They were right there, just a few feet away, but there was nothing to see. Just empty air and the staircase. "Hello?" My voice cracked as I called out. The footsteps stopped. For a moment, the silence returned. But then, from the shadows at the far end of the room, I heard a faint scraping sound. I swung my flashlight toward the noise. It came from an old cabinet. I wanted to leave. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but my legs wouldn't cooperate and curiosity got the better of me. Slowly, I edged closer to the cabinet. The scraping stopped as I was a few feet away. I reached out with a shaking hand, gripping the handle of the top drawer. My breath hitched as I pulled it open. This didn't make sense to me. Suddenly, a cold breath tickled the back of my neck. My flashlight flickered, and in that brief moment of darkness, I heard a whisper.
"You're gonna die here,"
it said. I spun around, but there was no one there. The footsteps started again, this time circling me. Faster, louder, closer. I dropped the flashlight and ran as fast as I could. I didn't care where I was going, only that I needed to get out. My feet pounded against the floor as I scrambled up the staircase. I didn't stop. I ran until I was outside in the cold night air. To this day, I don't know what I encountered in that basement. I didn't believe in the paranormal before, but after this, I'm not so sure anymore. There's something about abandoned buildings that draws people in. Maybe it's the thrill of breaking the rules, the eerie silence of a place once full of life, or the possibility that you might not be as alone as you think. For Chris, Dylan, and me, it was all of the above. We were always looking for a good scare, and when Dylan suggested we spend the night in the old abandoned factory on the middle of a forest, it seemed like the perfect challenge. We packed sleeping bags, flashlights, and enough snacks to last the night. The factory had been shut down for decades. Its windows were shattered and its walls were covered in graffiti. When we arrived, the sun was already setting. The factory loomed over us. The air was cold and the wind whistled as it blew through the broken windows. It was quite fascinating. "All right, this looks cool," Dylan said. "Let's find a good spot." We climbed through a hole in the chain-link fence and made our way inside. The factory was massive. Its interior felt like a maze of crumbling walls and debris scattered across the floor. We set up camp in a large room near the center of the building. It was as safe as any spot in an abandoned factory could be. It was dry, relatively clean, and far enough from the entrances to feel secure. By the time we rolled out our sleeping bags, the last light of day had faded, leaving us in the glow of our flashlights. We stayed up for hours talking and joking, the way friends do when they're pretending not to be scared. Every little noise made us jump, the creak of a rusty pipe, the distant sound of wind pushing through the building. But we laughed it off. Eventually, we all drifted off to sleep. I don't know how long I'd been out when I woke up to the sound of a loud bang. It echoed through the factory, sharp and unmistakable. A gunshot. My eyes flew open and I sat up. My heart was pounding. The others also woke up. "Did you hear that?" Chris whispered. "Yeah," Dylan said. "What the hell was that?" "It sounded like a gunshot," I said. We sat there in silence, straining to hear anything else. For a moment, there was nothing, just the sound of our breathing and the faint rustling of the wind outside. Then, about 2 minutes later, a scream came from somewhere close. I couldn't tell if it was inside or outside the factory. It was bone-chilling. It wasn't just a normal scream, which would have been terrifying enough. It was full of terror, raw and desperate in a way that can't be described. "What the hell is going on?" Chris hissed, gripping his flashlight like a weapon. "I don't know," Dylan said, "but I don't like it." It was pitch black outside the factory. We stayed huddled together. We were all too scared to move. We just sat there listening to the silence stretch on. And then came the laugh. It started faint, almost playful, but it grew louder. It didn't sound like it came from inside the factory, but it wasn't far off either. Who could be doing this and why? Surely they didn't have any good intentions. I wasn't sure what to do, so I looked over at Dylan and Chris. "Okay, screw this," Dylan said. "We're leaving. Right now." Chris and I didn't argue. We grabbed our stuff as fast as we could, not bothering to roll up our sleeping bags. My hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped my flashlight. We crept through the factory with our flashlights turned off as we didn't want to show our location to whoever was out there. The laughter faded as we moved, but the tension didn't. When we finally reached the hole in the fence, we ran for Dylan's car. It was parked about 50 yards away, on the side of the deserted road. My chest burned as I ran, and my heart felt like it might burst, but I didn't care. I wanted to get out of there. We piled into the car, slamming the door shut. Dylan fumbled with the keys, and the engine roared to life. "Go, go, go," Chris shouted. Dylan didn't need to be told twice. The car lurched forward, and we sped down the dark road, leaving the factory behind. For a moment, I felt relief. We were safe. We were out. But as the headlights lit up the road ahead, I saw what looked like a woman. Her black hair hung in tangled strands around her pale face. Her eyes were wide, almost unnaturally so, and they gleamed in the light like they were reflecting it back at us. She didn't move. She just stood there, staring straight at us as we passed. No one said a word as we drove by, but she looked directly at me. We were all in shock. I think we saw an actual ghost. We drove the rest of the way in silence, too scared to speak, too scared to look back. We agreed to never go back there. Exploring abandoned places was something I did for the thrill, for the mystery, and if I was being honest, for the escape. There was something about the quiet and decay of places left behind that gave me a sense of peace, like time had stopped just for me. But that calm wasn't what I felt that night in the old apartment complex on the edge of my town. The place was a notorious spot for urban explorers. Built in the 1970s, it had been abandoned for years after some legal dispute left it half renovated and forgotten. Nature had begun to reclaim the building. Vines were crawling up the cracked walls. I arrived a couple of hours before sunset. The outside was eerie enough, but the inside was something else entirely. The halls twisted and turned, and the floor plan was a confusing maze of empty apartments and dead ends. It was the kind of place where you could easily lose your sense of direction, especially in the dark. I wandered for a while, taking photos of broken furniture, peeling wallpaper, and graffiti that covered nearly every surface. The silence was heavy, interrupted only by the crunch of debris under my boots and the occasional sound of water dripping somewhere in the distance. As I moved deeper into the building, the narrow corridors seemed to stretch longer, and that was when I heard something. A faint sound behind me, a shuffle, like a footstep. I got goosebumps and it felt like my heart skipped a beat. I quickly turned, but there was nothing, just the same crumbling walls and scattered debris. "Hello?" I called out. No response. I shook my head, trying to laugh it off and convince myself that maybe it was an animal or just the building. I turned back and continued walking, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. A few minutes later, I heard it again. I spun around. That's when I saw him. A man, peeking around the corner of the hallway behind me. Just the half of his head and one shoulder visible. His face was partially hidden in shadow. The flashlight caught him, and he quickly ducked back behind the wall, disappearing from view. My breath caught in my throat. I didn't know what to do. I just stood there staring at the spot where he'd been. My mind raced. Was he another explorer, a squatter, or something else entirely? "Hey," I called out. "I didn't mean to bother you. I'm leaving, okay?" No answer. I swallowed hard, my pulse pounding in my ears. I could feel the adrenaline. I wasn't about to stick around to find out who or what this guy was or wanted. I started walking back the way I'd come. Luckily, it was the other direction from where I saw the man. As I turned another corner, I glanced back, and there he was again, peeking around another corner, just watching me. The light hit him, and once again he vanished behind the wall. A cold chill ran down my spine. I told myself to keep calm, to keep moving, but every time I turned around, he was there. Always the same, just peeking, just watching. And every time he would duck out of sight the second the light touched him. I picked up my pace. I was starting to freak out as I tried to retrace my steps. The maze-like layout of the building wasn't helping. Every hallway looked the same, every turn leading to another dark corridor. And still, every time I looked back, he was there. I didn't get a good look at his face, but from what I could see, there was no expression on it, just that eerie, blank stare as he watched me. I finally found the stairwell that led back to the ground floor. My body was trembling as I gripped the railing, practically leaping down the steps. The sound of my boots on the concrete echoed loudly, but I didn't care. I just wanted out. When I reached the front door, I flung it open and stepped outside. I didn't stop until I reached my car. I threw my stuff into the passenger seat, jumped in, and locked the doors. My hands were still shaking as I started the engine. As I pulled away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. For a split second, I thought I saw him standing in the doorway of the building, watching me leave. But when I looked again, he was gone. I never went back to that apartment complex. I don't know who or what that man was, and I don't want to know. All I know is that some places are better left alone.